Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The Palestine Chronicle has a piece entitled ICJ's New Advisory Opinion on Israel's Occupation. What will it mean? Well, for insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So on July 19th, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, unanimously adopted an advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The verdict was guilty on all counts, leading to a fear that a number of actions could be taken by states against the Israeli government as a result. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is speaking before Congress, begging for more support for genocide?
Well, it's difficult to really evaluate this International Court of Justice opinion because, on the one hand, it's immensely profound. On the other hand, we all know that the direct enforcement mechanism is not as sturdy as it can be or should be. In any case, it will have enormous political and diplomatic consequences, as evidenced by the fact that South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has just suggested that this was an enormous step forward. It will inevitably lead to more pressure on the war criminals in Israel. We know, as your comment suggested, that as we speak, that there is an attempt on Capitol Hill to effectuate a citizen's arrest of war criminal number one, speaking of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is wanted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Interestingly enough, the New York City Police Department, under former cop Eric Adams, the mayor, sent 200 of New York City's men and women in blue to Capitol Hill to precisely prevent that kind of citizen's arrest. Interestingly enough, the presumptive Democratic nominee for president, speaking of Vice President Harris, is boycotting this talk. She's in Indiana, speaking to a sorority of Black women. She has been joined in her boycott by Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who has spoken in unsparing terms about Mr. Netanyahu, and he has been joined by a number of his colleagues, including Dick Durbin, a leader of the leadership of the Democratic caucus in the U.S. Senate. They are joined in turn by countries like Spain, Ireland, and Norway, who have similarly been quite critical of Israeli war crimes in historic Palestine, which is evidentiary of a split in Europe. Meanwhile, Beijing, the leading country in the so-called developing world, has just hosted an enormously significant summit between Fatah, which has ruled on the West Bank for a number of years, and Hamas, now under siege in Gaza, and they have shaken hands and have basically emulated the Iranians and the Saudis, who too were hosted by the Chinese and too agreed to bury the hatchet in terms of their long-term antagonisms. And this particular maneuver is not only significant for Palestinian unity, it also is significant in terms of the global correlation of forces, suggesting that the role of China, which is already rising economically and politically, is also rising diplomatically as well. We all know that Benjamin Netanyahu, before October 7, 2023, thought he had a special relationship in Moscow, but he no longer can cultivate that particular illusion in light of his current war criminal status. A question that has not been posed, and when I outline it, you may understand why it has not been posed in the corporate media, is what will be the impact of the lame duck status of President Biden with regard to the U.S. role. That is to say, with Joseph R. Biden no longer having to face voters, reaching the end of his political career, will this unleash him? Will he decide to take steps to rein in the Israelis in order to smooth a path for his endorsed vice president, speaking of Vice President Harris, particularly in light of the fact that it's no secret that the Netanyahu forces in Israel would like to see a return to the White House of Donald J. Trump. You need only tune in to a number of Israeli chat shows. I'm thinking of the one by Caroline Glick, and like many Israeli supporters, she speaks with a thick U.S. accent and is quite unreserved in terms of her endorsement of Mr. Trump and his return to the White House. We also need to watch to see who Vice President Harris will pick as her running mate for November 2024. There are a number of choices, but if she picks the Pennsylvania governor, Josh Shapiro, you can bet your bottom dollar that that will suggest that she's in the tank for the Zionist lobby, because recall that Mr. Shapiro, unlike many U.S. governors, has been on the front lines in defending Israeli war crimes. Recall that when the president of the University of Pennsylvania was hauled before Congress a few months ago and made to face the music with regard to anti-Israeli protests on her Philadelphia campus, that Governor Shapiro led the charge for her sacking. This contrasts with other governors who have not necessarily been on the front lines in terms of criticizing Israel, but were not as forthright as Governor Shapiro in terms of backing Netanyahu. I'm speaking of Governor Pritzker of Illinois. I'm speaking of Governor Cooper of North Carolina, who, by the way, failed to comment with regard to an encampment on the Chapel Hill campus of the University of North Carolina that was backing the Palestinians. I'm thinking of Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, who apparently has the pole position right now with regard to being the nominee. In any case, recall that a few months ago, perhaps in an orchestrated maneuver from the White House, Vice President Harris herself came out for a ceasefire with regard to this conflict in Gaza. She was echoed by the NAACP, which ordinarily steers far clear from any kind of international engagement. And I think that that perhaps orchestrated maneuver by the White House to have Vice President Harris take a forthright position was a result of the severe reputational damage that U.S. imperialism is suffering as a result of their full-throated endorsement for Israeli war crimes thus far. How can the United States convincingly speak of a so-called rules-based international order? How can the United States convincingly speak of adhering to international law, the mirror opposite, actually, of Rubio, the rule-based international order, when it is so unreservedly supporting Israeli war crimes? Of course, that particular position that I've just articulated has been echoed by the government of President Petro in Colombia, who has joined a number of developing countries in denouncing Israeli war crimes. You see it as well with regard to the political positions of President Erdogan of Turkey. And keep in mind as well that that particular position of Turkey in terms of breaking off trade relations with Israel has resonated particularly in predominantly Islamic Africa, where in the wake, for example, of French and U.S. forces being ousted from Niger, you see that Turkey has moved in and has scooped up a number of contracts that previously had been allocated to Paris and Washington. You see a similar sort of development with regard to Somalia. It will not be long for countries like France and the Federal Republic of Germany and even Great Britain to read the tea leaves and recognize that this continued unequivocal support for Israel is basically a losing proposition. And I noticed that you gentlemen spoke of the Israeli difficulties in confronting the Yemenis who have been bombing Tel Aviv, of all places. And that's not even to mention the pressure that Israel is facing from its northern neighbors, speaking of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. In fact, a few weeks ago, Secretary of State Blinken announced what was obvious for all those who had been paying attention, which is that fundamentally northern Israel has been abandoned by Israel because of the threat from Hezbollah missiles. He did not mention the pressure coming from Iraq, for example. And of course, he could have gone on to talk about the internal pressure this is placing on Israel itself, with the High Court in Israel saying that the ultra-Orthodox have to be subjected to the draft, to conscription, which has led to massive demonstrations on their part. You see that the Netanyahu coalition is fraying, and this is ricocheting across the Atlantic, where you see a split in the pro-Zionist lobby. I'm thinking of the two pro-Zionist columnists for the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, who, as ever, has been highly critical of Mr. Netanyahu, and Bret Stephens, who is taking an opposite position. The Israeli lobby, of course, helped to defeat Congressman Jamal Bowman of the Congressional Black Caucus in Bronx, Westchester, in a recent New York State primary. The question is, will they be able to defeat his comrade, Black Caucus member Congresswoman Cori Bush, who is facing St. Louis voters, Black St. Louis voters, against the AIPAC-supported opponent, Wesley Bell? I think that all within range of my voice should recognize that you too have a stake in this ongoing battle. You need to ask if your pension fund has invested in Israeli bonds. Has your pension fund invested in corporations that are now ensconced in Israel? And I think that as well, we need to convince many Jewish American pro-Netanyahu voters that they're playing with fire in terms of their ongoing alliance with the white nationalist forces, particularly those in the leadership of the GOP. And I'm thinking of Bill Ackman, the Pershing Capital hedge fund guy who helped to engineer the downfall of Claudia Gay, the first Black woman president of Harvard, because of her less than enthusiastic support for Israeli war crimes. I'm thinking of Miriam Adelson, who, by the way, is not only a billionaire and a major supporter of Mr. Netanyahu personally, but also has major gambling interests in Macau, now under the leadership of the Communist Party of China. How long will that particular relationship be sustainable, given the fact that, as noted, the Communist Party of China has taken a vanguard position with regard to trying to broker peace between Hamas and Fatah? So Mr. Netanyahu has a very difficult agenda that he will be facing here in Washington, D.C. I would like to be a fly on the wall when he meets with Vice President Harris tomorrow, Thursday, July 25th, because we need to take her measure as well. Will she break with the thus far mealy-mouthed policy of Mr. Biden? And alternatively, will Mr. Biden, since he is now a lame duck, break with his own mealy-mouthed policy in order to pave the way for a new U.S. realistic policy towards the war criminals in Israel?
You mentioned that Vice President Harris is going to boycott or has boycotted Netanyahu's speech. We have just about 30 seconds. That begs the question, when is a boycott not a boycott? Because I read she's going to meet with him, quote unquote, secretly tomorrow. 30 seconds.
Well, I think that we need to recognize that it was not so long ago that U.S. politicians would beg to be in a photo op with Mr. Netanyahu. But obviously that's not the case today.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Folks, you are